Hi everyone, I'm Victor Benavides, and today I'll be offering the pros and cons of recreational marijuana use and its legalization. Though this debate covers a wide range of topics, I'd like you all to focus on COPD specifically as a key issue. According to the CDC, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, is a group of respiratory diseases that block airflow and create breathing problems. This group of diseases includes emphysema and chronic bronchitis, for example. Symptoms of COPD include frequent coughing and wheezing, excess phlegm, mucus, and sputum production, shortness of breath, and trouble taking a deep breath. The CDC adds that COPD was the third leading cause of death in the US as recently as 2014. As a side note, this debate shifts between the terms marijuana and cannabis, both of which are referring to the same thing. Before I begin, consider pausing and thinking about your current opinion. As both sides are offered in four main sections, consider the differing conclusions each side comes to, and maybe try giving the side opposite of your opinion some extra thought. So, should there be restrictions on the use, legalization of marijuana? So, another quick side note, I'm by myself, so this is a lot easier. This is going to be the pro yes side, and this is going to represent the con no side. So, I guess keep that in mind as we go. And then I also have a timer here to the left, and that's what I'm going to keep looking at. Okay. So starting with the pro-yes side. First question, should the U.S. outlaw the smoking of marijuana or restrict it similarly to tobacco smoking restrictions? According to Johnston and colleagues, the vast majority of marijuana use is in the form of smoking, and the American Thoracic Society, or ATS, states that despite few research studies covering the effect of marijuana on the lungs, it's clear that there's no safe way to smoke marijuana. We also know that smoking tobacco causes bronchitis and COPD, and the ATS notes that marijuana smoke contains many of the same harmful chemicals. ATS also tells us that heavy marijuana smokers are likely to develop lung damage, specifically bullae, which are large air sacs in the lungs causing shortness of breath that can be life-threatening if they were to rupture and collapse the lung. Marijuana users with pre-existing lung conditions like asthma, for example, are at a heightened risk of their condition worsening, which can lead to hospitalization or death. This also includes those who may believe they've outgrown their asthma, which is a common misconception. The second question here, do the benefits of marijuana use outweigh the negative effects? The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we'll call them the academies for short, in 2017, the academies found substantial evidence of an association between long-term cannabis use, specifically smoking, and worsening respiratory symptoms and more frequent chronic bronchitis episodes. The academies also found moderate evidence of an association between the cessation of cannabis smoking and improvements in respiratory symptoms. Because cessation can reverse the respiratory symptoms use has caused, this is likely why many don't consider marijuana a cause of COPD diagnosis, in my opinion. But this doesn't change the fact that these symptoms are experienced while smoking. In addition, the academies also noted a moderate association between cannabis use and increased risk of overdose and respiratory distress among pediatric populations, specifically in states where cannabis is legal. So the third question here, does legalization promote marijuana use or regulate its use more effectively? So as of March 2020, 11 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized recreational marijuana use. Very quickly, these states include Alaska, California, Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Nevada, Oregon, Vermont, Washington, and again, D.C. Marijuana first became legal in Colorado, soon followed by Washington State, both of which legalized recreational use in 2012. Ballotpedia tells us that marijuana use in the 12 and older age bracket was 7% exact in 2011, and it has since risen to 10.1% as of 2018. The 18 to 25 and 26 and older age brackets saw similar increases in marijuana use among 18 to 25 rose from 19% in 2011 to 22.1% in 2018, or just over a 3% increase. And 26 and older rose from 4.8% to 8.6%, almost 4% increase. So finally here, should the US consider its path toward the full legalization in marijuana? Or I'm sorry, continue its path toward full legalization of marijuana. Johnston and colleagues have noted a steep decline in the perceived risk of regular marijuana use among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, beginning in the early 2000s. While personal disapproval of trying marijuana remains relatively high in these students, the overall trend is downward, meaning more 8th, 10th, and 12th graders are willing to try marijuana. In addition, 1/3 of 8th graders, 2/3 of 10th graders, and 80% of 12th graders report that marijuana is quote-unquote fairly or quote-unquote very easily obtainable. In my opinion, legalized recreational use sets a dangerous precedent among our nation's youth. Let's also not forget that marijuana is a Schedule I drug, meaning it has a high potential for dependency. And this is also the same categorization you can find heroin, LSD, and ecstasy, for example. Overall, there's a lack of scientific research on marijuana, and as a result, there's a lack of information on its health implications. Therefore, I don't believe the US should continue forward toward full legalization, or at least not yet. So, next, we're going to do the opening statement for cons. So, again, following the same pattern, first question, should the US outlaw smoking of marijuana or restrict it similarly to tobacco smoking restrictions? So again, as stated, 11 states have legalized recreational marijuana, and again, that's in addition to Washington, D.C. So Sullivan and colleagues determined overall COPD burden for individual states based on 10 key metrics that they used, and with these metrics, they gave the states a score of 1 to 5, with 1 being the best and 5 being the worst. So they found that Colorado, which has been a legal state since 2012, was among the best states with an average score between 1.5 and 2.5. So to put this in perspective, Indiana averaged 3.5 to 4.5. Overall, there doesn't seem to be any evidence suggesting the legalization of recreational marijuana leads to increased COPD rates among residents. So next question, do the benefits of marijuana use outweigh the negative effects? So in 2017, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or again, the academies for short, found conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective treatment for chronic pain, chemo-induced nausea and vomiting, and multiple sclerosis, spasticity symptoms. The academies also found moderate evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids can improve short-term sleep outcomes, in individuals with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis. All in all, cannabis offers many benefits to its users. And I would say overall, these benefits outweigh the risks. So does legalization promote marijuana use or regulate its use more effectively? Legalization of marijuana, recreational marijuana, has shown to boost the economy of states where it's been legalized. So a brief example provided by the Joint Economic Committee Democrats can better prove my point. Based on the average cost of housing a single inmate, which is around $30,000, they found that states can save millions of dollars by decreasing cannabis arrests, doing simple math. They also found that the legal marijuana industry is estimated to pull in a total of $23 billion in sales, a total which will be reached by 2022. So legalization of this industry also ensures quality marijuana being used by placing restrictions throughout the supply chain, from growers to distributors to retailers and to testing laboratories. So these regulations have also led to child restraint packaging as a requirement in states like Colorado and Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, for example. So buying marijuana illegally, on the street, quote unquote, the user never knows what's being consumed. And perhaps this has been a cause of many COPD concerns. So finally, should the US continue its path toward the full legalization of marijuana? Yes, because there's very little evidence to suggest that marijuana leads to the development of COPD, and the evidence that is available is minimal and completely uncertain. So research on marijuana remains difficult due to the federal laws and guidelines restricting research, and this has led to many states' hesitation to transition toward legalization. So the Academy notes that regulatory barriers hinder the advancement of cannabis research, and this is the primary reason for uncertainty and discrepancies in the conclusions that you can find in many research articles. So I believe that adjusting these barriers, specifically cannabis's classification as a Schedule 1 drug, would allow for more research. And yes, again, I do believe we should continue toward full legalization. So I'm going to reset that, take a quick drink because I'm spitting everywhere. All right. And then again, we're going to go back to the pro side of this argument for the rebuttal. So let me adjust here, restart my timer. Don't know why I'm talking to myself. It's a break, so I guess it doesn't matter. All right. So again, same general questions we're going to address, and I'm going to address a little bit, respond to the opening statement of the con, and then respond to the opening statement of the pro. So first, should the U.S. outlaw the smoking of marijuana or restrict it similarly to tobacco smoking restrictions? So in your opening stance, you stated that there doesn't seem to be any evidence suggesting the legalization of recreational marijuana leads to increased rates of COPD among residents. And you provided age-adjusted rates for Colorado and Indiana to strengthen your stance. However, it must be noted that there are many risk factors for COPD, like pollutants in the public environment, home pollutants, allergies and asthma, exacerbation with pets, for example, many different factors. So a simple side-by-side comparison without acknowledgement to these many risk factors is not a sufficient argument to suggest that marijuana use does not impact individual COPD. So the Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University dubbed the marijuana revolution Big Tobacco 2.0 because they believe that much like tobacco, the true long-term health and economic repercussions of marijuana commercialization likely won't present themselves until decades later. If marijuana does in fact increase rates of COPD, they may not show until decades down the road. So do the benefits of marijuana use outweigh the negative effects? I, of course, acknowledge the evidence of some benefits to medical marijuana use, but the question becomes, do these benefits outweigh the risks? Risks like COPD, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, and other respiratory issues with symptoms like chronic smoker's cough, chronic phlegm, shortness of breath, inability to take a deep breath, wheezing, tight chest, and squeaky breathing, for example. Assuming everyone believes these benefits outweigh the risk is not a strong argument, in my opinion. And that argument needs to be taken into consideration when wondering if we should even legalize marijuana and if these people are going to take these risks. So, does legalization promote marijuana use or regulate its use more effectively? So, in your opening stance, you noted the financial benefits of legalization, specifically the millions states would save with decreased cannabis arrests and billions the marijuana industry is set to gain by 2022. Do these financial gains offset the losses that come with legalization? So, for example, in 2017, the academies noted substantial evidence of an association between cannabis use and increased risk of motor vehicle crashes. In 2018, the Centennial Institute found that 69% of Colorado marijuana users admitted to having driven under the influence at least once, and 27%, so over a quarter of all users, admitted to doing so every single day. With this admission, the Centennial Institute sought to determine the true economic impact legalized recreational use had on the state of Colorado since its legalization. And they noted three key findings. So one, every $1 gained in tax revenue was faced with approximately $4.50 spent to mitigate the effects of marijuana legalization. Number two, marijuana users tend to live sedentary lifestyles, which exacerbates health issues and leads to increased medical costs. And three, the marijuana industry contributed a yield of 18.78 million pieces of plastic and 393,053 pounds of CO2 emissions in 2016 alone. So remember how I said environmental factors play a role in COPD onset? Look at that CO2 emissions. Overall, the research of the economic impact of recreational use has been too shallow and one-sided to fully to understand the full impact, and it must be researched further. You also noted that legalization provides the appropriate regulations to ensure safe marijuana use, especially among children. According to the Centennial Institute, calls to Colorado's poison control increased dramatically since marijuana legalization. And according to Wang and colleagues, 163 calls regarding children 10 and under were made from 2009 to 2015. Again, 163 calls regarding children 10 and under specific to marijuana were made from 2009 to 2015. These calls increased at a rate higher than all other states, and nearly half of all child hospital cases in the 2 years following Colorado's legalization were recreational marijuana exposures. Also, nearly 15 people are severely burned each year due to their use, so it seems not all negative effects of marijuana can be limited through tough regulations. Again, should the U.S. continue its path toward the full legalization of marijuana? Federal laws and guidelines may be hindering the research of marijuana, and I would agree that these should be revisited, but I would also say that the research, like the research I presented, may not show marijuana to be entirely favorable. So you may not like the answer once research is done on marijuana. All right. Should the outlaw, or I do this every time, should the U.S. outlaw the smoking of marijuana or restrict it similarly to tobacco smoking restrictions? So in your opening statement, you stated that most marijuana use comes in the form of smoking. While this is true, there are many who are transitioning to vaping to avoid smoke inhalation, and these particular devices pull the active ingredients like THC from the marijuana and collect their vapor in a little collection tube to be inhaled by the user. Ribeiro and Ind note that the effects of marijuana vaping are unknown, but it's been strongly suggested that vaping may reduce the symptoms that smoking causes. So there are several other alternatives to smoking as well, including dabbing, oral ingestion or edibles, sprays, topical oils, and liquid extracts. So in regard to smoking itself, though, the Academy stated that there's no clear evidence of association between cannabis use and COPD, asthma, or worsening lung condition. In addition, Kashkin noted that despite limited research, well-designed epidemiological studies show no increased risk for the development of lung or upper airway cancer from light or moderate use of marijuana, and the evidence regarding heavy long-term use is mixed. You also mentioned bullae development in lungs as a result of heavy use. According to Ribeiro and Ind, they reported that this belief is based specifically on anecdotal evidence, clarifying that as of 2018, only 7 case series and 11 case reports have been published specifically on this topic. And as for those living with asthma, the Academy's found little to no evidence suggesting any association between cannabis use, specifically smoking, and the development or exacerbation of asthma. Do the benefits of marijuana outweigh the negative effects? So in 2018, Ribeiro and Ind found that marijuana smoke seems to increase symptoms of chronic bronchitis, but there has been no definitive association between marijuana smoking and shortness of breath or irreversible airway changes. To me, this sounds like the risks and side effects of alcohol use in terms of temporary symptoms is very similar. So for alcohol, once the use is ceased, you stop using it and drinking it, normal body functions return. Same for marijuana. You stop using marijuana, normal body functions return. The respiratory effects of tobacco use are permanent. The respiratory effects of marijuana use are temporary. Yes, the academies did find evidence of improvements in respiratory symptoms with the cessation of cannabis use, but interestingly, they also found moderate evidence of an association between the acute use of marijuana and improved airway dynamics. These points don't necessarily mean that everyone should stop using marijuana, but rather they suggest that, much like alcohol, moderation is key. So does legalization promote marijuana use or regulate its use more effectively? In your opening statement, you noted that marijuana use has increased among those 12 and older in Colorado and Washington. The evidence showing an increase in 12 and older age bracket isn't really sufficient evidence to suggest that children are using marijuana more frequently because it includes all ages above 12. So, like you stated, Ballotpedia added that age brackets 18 to 25 and 26 and older have shown similar increases, which would obviously add to the totals among those 12 and older. So federal regulations, in my opinion, will help control underage marijuana use, just like it helps to control underage tobacco use, just like it helps to control underage alcohol use. Yes, some still use it underage, but it's very heavily regulated and difficult for them to use. So should the US continue its path toward the full legalization of marijuana? Perhaps legalization of marijuana would set a dangerous precedent among our nation's youth. I'll give you that. Or maybe it would have the reverse effect. So Rausbach cited research that found individuals aged 21 show a sharp decrease in binge drinking if they reside in a state where marijuana has been legalized. So this research showed increases in marijuana use among residents of legal states, but in illegal states, like Indiana, for example, there's a sharp increase in binge drinking when an individual turns 21. So the research seems to indicate that individuals turn to alcohol in illegal states once they turn 21 and that drinking barrier is removed because marijuana remains, that was not supposed to happen. So because marijuana remains illegal in those states, but in legal states, remove drinking and marijuana barriers at age 21 and this dynamic changes. They start turning to alcohol. I'm sorry, in legal states, they start turning to marijuana instead of alcohol because marijuana is legal and they tend to prefer that. Very sorry about that. That completely threw me off. A little bit here, so a little bit more here. So to address your statement regarding marijuana being a Schedule I drug, you're not wrong, but the classification is wrong. The classification is outdated and in serious need of an upgrade. So the Drug Policy Alliance, or DPA, specifies that the Schedule I classification is reversed for drugs that have a high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety. And I'm sorry, it's reserved for those specific drugs. Marijuana's potential for abuse is limited, and it has established medical uses. And compared to other drugs, it's relatively safe to use. So you and I seem to agree that there's insufficient evidence and a lack of information, but I believe that the evidence we do have is suggesting that marijuana is much safer than tobacco, much safer than alcohol, which both remain legal, regulated, and taxed. Therefore, marijuana should be similarly regulated. All right. So moving down to my closing, start with the pro. Okay. So again, should the US outlaw the smoking of marijuana or restrict it similarly to tobacco smoking restrictions? So you're right that there are many alternatives to smoking marijuana, but the fact remains the vast majority of use consists of smoking and inhalation. It's a reduction in symptoms doesn't necessarily equate to a complete lack of symptoms. And I'd also argue that given the alternatives being presented to avoid marijuana, smoking, and inhalation, this only further suggests that there's concern with smoking marijuana and that it may pose health risks. It should be regulated similarly to tobacco, and it should, or at least to some degree, should be regulated. Many of these alternatives aren't necessarily safe themselves, though. So the CDC has noted an outbreak of lung injury associated with e-cigarette use and vaping, and this is including the use of both methods to ingest THC. So to me, no clear evidence of an association, as the academies stated it, seems like a biased way of admitting that not enough is known about the topic without blatantly admitting that not enough is known about the topic. So this type of argument places people at unknown risk without being completely honest about the potential health impact and it being entirely unknown. So some, even if minimal research, suggests that marijuana use is associated with COPD, is associated with asthma, and is associated with worsening lung condition. Lung cancer might not be a known risk at this point, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a risk. It's pretty well documented, though, that marijuana smoking can exacerbate lung conditions like asthma. I do agree that anecdotal evidence, as you pointed out, isn't as strong as well documented and researched, peer reviewed evidence. However, until that can be provided, anecdotal evidence remains relevant. I believe strict restrictions on marijuana remain necessary as we continue our attempt to understand marijuana's complete effects on health and wellness and the human body in general. And the major tobacco movement, as we know, began with this habit that was not yet fully understood but seemed cool. And it turned out that tobacco had a significant impact on health and well being. And it wasn't until decades of use that it was fully understood. The same may very likely be true about marijuana. So, do the benefits of marijuana use outweigh the negative effects? You cited research by Ribeiro and End, who admitted an extreme limitation on valid marijuana research, yet still offered a biased answer that, quote unquote, there's been no definitive association between marijuana and respiratory issues. This lack of association is due to a lack of reliable and consistent evidence, so it can also be said that there's no definitive association between marijuana smoke and completely unchanged respiratory health. It's very much the same. The documented and anecdotal evidence showing the negative effects of marijuana use is roughly equal to the evidence available showing the positive effects. So, with that being said, I haven't I haven't been convinced that the potential benefits outweigh the potential risks, and I believe the government is offering a risky substance to the public, and in doing so, it should be heavily regulated, especially with the hindsight we now have regarding tobacco use. So, does legalization promote marijuana use or regulate its use more effectively? We can ignore the increasing marijuana use for young children if you'd like, but what is definitive is that the perceived risk of marijuana is on a sharp decline among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders and has been since the 2000s. Ultimately, starting at a young age is always worse, but that's not really my main point. My main point is that it's becoming more accepted and more of a norm that is perceived as less harmful by children than it was only 1 to 2 decades ago. The perception of minimal risk increases the likelihood of people trying marijuana, which makes it more difficult to regulate and ensure proper use. So, finally and ultimately, should the US continue its path toward the full legalization of marijuana? I will hand it to you. The research you cited linking lower binge drinking among 21-year-olds attending college in legal states is very interesting. However, I don't believe that switching out alcohol for marijuana is a great thing, as both have been shown to contribute to significant health issues. Your rebuttal also noted that the similarities among marijuana use and alcohol use. So, is this really a positive shift in health behaviors? I'd also like to add that smoking marijuana puts others at risk in a way alcohol consumption doesn't: secondhand smoke. So, marijuana smoke contains carcinogens, much like tobacco smoke, and the CDC notes a lot of uncertainty around secondhand marijuana smoke exposure and its impact on chronic diseases, but there is still concern with the possible connection. In regard to marijuana's Schedule 1 classification, I do agree that it's inaccurate and a reclassification would help open the door to more research opportunities. Reclassification of marijuana, though, to a different schedule of drugs will not remove the inherent risk marijuana brings to the table. Marijuana is also often referred to as the gateway drug, so although it may seem relatively safe to other drugs individually, its potential as a gateway drug makes it very risky. I'd also like to close with this. Determining the legality of something based on whether or not other things are legal isn't smart. It's not a smart way to make decision, and marijuana, in my opinion, should be looked at in a vacuum without comparisons between it and other legal substances. I think it makes sense to slow down the US's path toward full legalization of marijuana so that we don't end up in a big tobacco 2.0, while also classifying marijuana's drug scheduling to ensure the most complete research is the right thing. I don't see that research helping your case in any way. I think we're just going to find out that it's very similar, albeit not on the same level as tobacco, but very risky. And that's all for my pro stance. All right. So to end it, Should the U.S. outlaw the smoking of marijuana or restrict it similarly to tobacco smoking restrictions? It's true that the state comparisons of COPD is not a completely fair comparison, but one would assume that a legitimate connection between marijuana and COPD would be shown through high rates of COPD in states where marijuana is legal, but that's simply not the case. We can ignore that analysis, though, if you would like. Dubbing marijuana Big Tobacco 2.0 is an extreme misrepresentation of marijuana because research has shown that marijuana use is many times safer than tobacco use. Because marijuana use is nowhere near as dangerous as tobacco use, it doesn't make sense to place the same restrictions currently placed on tobacco use on marijuana. Current regulations, including age restrictions, taxation, and more, are more than enough, though I do believe that regulations should always be revisited for updates. Do the benefits of marijuana use outweigh the negative effects? Yes, in short, they do. I believe the benefits of marijuana use outweigh the potential risks. If this wasn't the case, why would marijuana be available for medicinal use in 33 states, Washington, D.C., Guam, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands? So to clarify, the argument covering the benefits versus the potential risk of marijuana use isn't based on the assumption that everyone believes the benefits outweigh the potential risks. The argument is that marijuana should be made available for people to decide on their own if its benefits outweigh the potential risks. Sorry about that. Smoking in the form of smoking marijuana is known to be the highest potential for risk. But as I've stated, again, there are numerous safer ways in which marijuana can be ingested, and these can be more heavily promoted to get people to remove smoking from their marijuana regimen and, take edibles or use vaping or topical oils. Does legalization promote marijuana use or regulate its use more effectively? In 2014, there were 111 million self-reported incidents of alcohol-impaired driving among U.S. adults, according to the CDC. In 2016, 28% of all traffic-related deaths, or a total of 10,497 deaths, were due to alcohol-impaired driving. This is the equivalent to about 1 in every 3 traffic deaths being the result of drunk driving. Drunk driving still remains a prevalent issue in the U.S., but the country has taken many steps to reduce the number of incidents. The U.S. can take similar steps to work with marijuana-impaired driving, with the benefit of already having learned a few techniques from drunk driving interventions. The information you provided so far throughout pretty much your entire argument is only specific to Colorado, with 10 other states plus DC having legalized recreational use. We need to see the data for all states and DC to fully understand the true impact marijuana has on the economy and health and wellness. The legalized marijuana industry is still in its infancy, so the manufacturing and distribution systems are still being refined. Given time, plastic yields and CO2 emissions will certainly go down. With the appropriate level of regulation, poison control calls, overdosing, and burns can all be mitigated. Alcohol-related injuries account for 10 to 18% of all ER visits, and the rate of ER visits has climbed nearly 50% for alcohol-related injuries from 2006 to 2014. 20 to 30% of all non-fatal injuries that occur in the home involve alcohol. Before we try to address a small issue like legalized marijuana use, let's first address alcohol-related injuries and deaths, as alcohol has long remained illegal throughout the country. Regulation should be revisited to ensure that children specifically do not have access to marijuana, and I will give you that. But this is also an issue with alcohol. This is also an issue with tobacco. Specifically to alcohol, according to the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, in 2018, 7.1 million people ages 12 to 20 reported drinking alcohol beyond just a few sips in the past month. Again, we need to focus on the issues at hand rather than trying to chastise a new drug that has already been shown quite effectively to not be nearly as dangerous as alcohol or tobacco. Sorry. So, should the U.S. continue its path toward the full legalization of marijuana? When compared to other legal options like smoking and alcohol, recreational marijuana use is the much safer option, and that's very obvious. Before trying to tackle a substance with little to no evidence suggesting respiratory harm or other injuries, specifically COPD, perhaps we should focus on the more dangerous substances like alcohol and tobacco. Tobacco being something that actually causes COPD. Specific regulations can be revisited for public and child health, but I don't believe this should hinder the progress being made toward full legalization of a relatively safe drug that also has medicinal uses. So, yes, overall, and simply put, the US should continue its path toward full legalization of marijuana, and no, there is no reliable evidence to suggest it has any connection to COPD. So thank you all for listening. Again, that was my debate on the recreational use and legalization of marijuana, the con and the pro side. Go ahead and make your choice. I guess I won't give my personal opinion, but I do thank you for listening, and I'm excited to see your guys' responses to my debate. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.